Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully,
Yes.
get a thumbs up from somebody. Awesome. All right. It is great to be back at PNSQC for the 2021 conference. Last year's event, which was my first year speaking, seems like both yesterday and a lifetime ago, but I really appreciate that in spite of all we've been through in the last year, this conference and the other PNSQC events throughout the year have been going strong and helping us keep tabs on trends in quality, even during a time of major change in the world that has impacted how many of us work. Which brings me to the topic at hand. Last spring, my company joined many others in going fully remote due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We already had a few remote team members in development, including myself. I got like a 6-month head start on everyone, but it was still a really big adjustment during a time of a lot of unknowns to go fully remote. And we weren't alone in this experience. Many tech employers suddenly found themselves grappling with the same transition. So in my experience working at a company that builds iOS and Android apps for use by emergency medical workers, the team really needed to significantly rework our test strategy to continue ensuring a top quality product as a work from home team, especially during a time that health systems were stressed and we didn't have any wiggle room to let our quality standards fall. And I'm excited to say that after over a year of adapting, we recently decided to officially close the office and become a fully remote company. And the shifts that allowed the team to maintain high quality mobile apps without working in a shared physical space made me wonder how similar companies were responding to the remote work challenges. So I did some research, and this talk is the result where I'd like to share my findings. So I'll start by sharing some of the tech tools that have been front runners in helping mobile test teams function optimally. Then I'll move on to ways to intentionally craft team dynamics and why that's important. And lastly, we'll ask you to consider pulling quality to the left in the development process. These will hopefully bring inspiration or helpful coping mechanisms to anyone still living in a remote mobile app testing world, or even those adapting to hybrid teams with some office time and some work from home time. A couple of notes before we begin, though. First, this is hopefully obvious, but I'm here speaking from my personal experience and research. And while this includes stories from my current workplace, I'm not here using their words or messaging. I'm not trying to sell you anything. And second, I'm speaking mostly from the perspective of the mobile development world, but many of the takeaways are generic and could easily be applied to other types of software testing. So if that's you, please stay and listen. So without further ado, let's actually dive in. My first finding for remote mobile testing success is that you need the right technology. But what are those tools? There's always some new software out there that's getting a lot of buzz in the industry, but it may or may not revolutionize how you tackle mobile QA in an increasingly remote world. And it turns out that instead of always reaching for that new shiny toy, it's more beneficial to think of your goals, then pick the best tool for the job. So Chris will like this one, but the famously all remote company GitLab has an opinion on technology. And I love this quote: "Do not fixate on the medium. Instead, fixate on the outcome. Instead of attempting to create a virtual whiteboard, for example, focus on what outcomes you typically expect from a whiteboarding session. And in a remote setting, a team must be intentional about everything, including a fixation on results. And this requires a change of mentality," unquote. So to summarize, they're saying not to pick the popular tool expecting it to solve all your problems. It's about knowing what your individual team needs to accomplish and picking the best product to help you reach that goal with intentionality. But of course, after carefully zeroing in on the testing goal at hand, you still need a good working knowledge of the technology out there to choose from to help you reach your goal. So luckily, I rounded up a list of the tools available to mobile dev teams that got a lot of press in the last year. So let's take a look. So I've broken these into use case categories, and they're not all mobile specific, as you'll see. I want to start with tools used for team communication. And it's likely a surprise to no one that video platforms Zoom and Microsoft Teams gained immense usage and popularity during the pandemic. Guessing these are new to no one here. You're all already using them. But thinking back to the advice from GitLab, if the goal is to get the team in the same room for a meeting in which everyone has a chance to be both heard and seen, but the team can't physically gather, these tools do an excellent job enabling a semblance of being face-to-face. But I challenge you, in addition to implementing one of these tools, consider checking out each platform's customizations and putting more intentionality into how you're using the tool. For example, as mobile testers, it can be really beneficial to share your screen often and show a simulator or emulator versus trying to hold a physical device up to the camera. More on that in a minute, so stay tuned. It's also worth setting up some preferences, such as hiding your own video score by default while keeping your camera on for others. I know this sounds weird, but it's a good idea because science has shown us that, like Narcissus in the Greek myth, our eyes will constantly go to our own image if it's there, rather than remaining engaged with others. And we know that seeing our reflection probably didn't happen when we were back in the office, so it probably does not serve the goal of using a video platform to replace in-person meetings. These are just two ideas to consider. Based on your team's individual goals for meetings, setting other best practices or preferences might make sense. So moving on to another one that will surprise no one, Slack needs no introduction in terms of its power as a chat tool. From the mobile testing perspective, I'd like to draw attention to Slack's ability to integrate with other tools via things like webhooks functionality. And webhooks allow posting information from other apps directly into Slack, which can then make the Slack UI a one-stop shop for mobile testing info. So as one example, your team might consider funneling error messages from logs to an errors channel, or maybe output mobile automation results to their own channel. And I love this option because, unlike some other automation results UIs in Slack, the whole point is communication. So the results show up via the webhook, and if something went sideways, the team can start a discussion right away about what next steps needs to be. And it's also just a couple of keystrokes to pull in a developer to view the results versus maybe your developer doesn't even have a license or log into the tool you use for mobile automation runs. So that feedback loop gets a lot tighter. Lastly, and this one is specific to mobile, my team stumbled upon a tool called Reflector last year and ended up using it constantly because we test a lot on physical devices in addition to simulators and emulators. And after going remote, we found ourselves in that bad practice of holding a cell phone up to our webcam every day to demonstrate defects or share information about new app behavior. And it was just an exercise in frustration. There was a lot of like, the screen is facing the webcam, not me, so I'm trying to tap and I'm not finding what I need. And then meanwhile, my teammates are like squinting at the screen, trying to see what I'm doing. So everyone ended up just annoyed and with eye strain. So we realized there had to be a better way. And we began using this screen mirroring tool called Reflector that allows us to show a phone's screen on our computer monitor. And it's a physical device being projected onto the computer monitor. Then we can use the video calling platform screen sharing functionality so everyone can see the full-size phone. Moving on, let's jump to the automation tools category. And after scouring the internet, 3 tools stood out, but interestingly, they're not new players in this space. It's almost as if test teams are looking to well-established vendors during this uncertain time, specifically for their mature product offerings versus considering newer options. So apologies in advance since these aren't new and shiny, but hopefully it will at least be a fun trip down memory lane and at best an insightful peek into how the pandemic is changing us. So first is Ranorex. And as I mentioned, they're not a new player, but in some ways this is great because they know what their customers want and they provide a product that has a lot of functionality and flexibility because this isn't their first rodeo. They provide a GUI-based automation framework for mobile, web, and desktop applications. And I was impressed that they could provide such a one-stop shop for automation across a whole platform versus just mobile, because my work, and I'm guessing many of yours, you have your mobile apps, but you at least have a backend to test as well. And at my work, we also have web and a public API. And it would be really nice to have automation all in one place for all of those. I was also pleasantly surprised to find that they support both newer and seasoned automation engineers by offering both scriptless and script-ed options for creating tests. The next option, Appium, also not a new name, and they are also not actually an automation tool, though they do have a desktop option with a GUI if you want. They're a framework aiming to enable users to create top-of-the-line mobile automation via a free and open source tool. And their laser focus on mobile versus trying to support all the types of automation in a company make it popular for users who might be disillusioned by one-size-fits-all tools. Also, the possibility of code reuse between iOS and Android flavors of an app make it understandably tempting for mobile testers that are always struggling to support separate but very similar automation code bases for iOS and Android apps. And lastly, Test Complete. This was the first automation tool I used like 9 years ago. They provide a mobile automation solution these days that actually integrates with Appium with a very approachable UI for those newer to the framework or coding. And it also provides a way to record and test the different gestures a user might employ to interact with the mobile device via a GUI, which I thought was cool. And I didn't see many competitors offering at such a sophisticated level yet. It's worth noting that this capability does come from the Appium integration, but the Test Complete GUI is extremely clear and intuitive. And lastly, there are a few tools for collaboration and transparency across the mobile development team that I wanted to hit on, like GitHub or GitLab, Jira, and Microsoft Office or G Suite. We all know what these are used for, but coming back to that intentionality in a time of remote work in which the in-office's practices fall short, it's worth revisiting best practices around how we use these to maximize usability, efficiency, and accessibility. For example, my team kind of used our Microsoft Office or G Suite solution in a fast and loose way when we were all in HQ, and found that didn't work great when we all went to work from home. Maybe the team veterans did okay, but when we brought on new team members, they really struggled to find the documents they needed within a disorganized structure. So decluttering and organizing effort had to happen to make sure that those documents had the right permissions, they had clear names, and they were organized in folders that made sense by team and project so that anybody could find them. So I hope that this list of tools proves useful, but more than that, I hope that you work with your team to reframe the narrative around technology so that these tools are serving your task at hand rather than driving the direction or outcomes of your work. All right, moving on. As per a recent study from Gallup, about 70% of workers in tech fields are still working remotely or in a hybrid setting. And key, most of us want the option to continue to work from home, at least part-time. This brings us to my second point, which is the importance of carefully planning how you'll stay connected as a team in a remote work culture, both from the perspective of managers making a plan to support their direct reports and individuals wanting to do their part as a team player. I'd argue a strong group where individuals help each other out is always important, but is especially so for a team maintaining the quality of mobile apps. It's a really big task given the range of devices and OSs out there to support. And I would argue that mobile testers perhaps don't have the option to go it alone quite as much as testers in other spaces might. So there's just too many permutations to cover, right? So we have to be more collaborative. So that's a lot of talk of staying connected as a team, but what I also want to cover in this slide is that in the past year, we've been shown that maintaining a happy and functional remote team is a balancing act. And you're balancing getting the best semblance of face time you can, while also making it clear that unplugging, rest, setting boundaries around work are really vital to remote success as well. So I'll spend some time talking about that tricky balance. And because I want to keep that balance front of mind, I've included a photo here of the US women's gymnastics team. First, because they literally have excellent balancing skills, but also because of the way Simone Biles prioritized both striving for excellence in the sport, as well as prioritizing taking care of herself amidst the stress that comes with competition at her athletic level this past summer. So for team connectedness, there are a couple of best practices that I wanted to touch on. And we came up with some easy to remember sayings. So Zoom early, Zoom often, and camera on culture are two things we try to do. Zoom early, Zoom often simply means that if we hit a question we can't solve on our own, we reach out to somebody else via a quick video call sooner rather than later, because we believe that two heads are better than one. And it's generally acknowledged that part of each workday is spent helping each other out. It's worth noting that also these calls are ideally short, just long enough to point the person with the question in the right direction, just like the Q&A sessions that would happen organically in an office. Camera on culture. This one's a little touchy. So camera on culture is a conscious effort to maintain the body language and facial expressions that clue us into additional meaning that would otherwise be lost in a remote culture. So it's important to note that active listening is extremely useful here on the part of the meeting leader for both team members who might not be sighted or team members who otherwise missed an important nonverbal cue. So I've been trying to practice saying something like, oh, I noticed that when so-and-so brought up the last point regarding the product ship date, your eyes got really big. I'd love to hear your thoughts around the current plan. Things like that can really help. So as I wrap up these two, it's worth noting that these approaches do not mean that teams are on video calls all day or that everyone keeps their camera on for the entire duration of every single video call. Those are exhausting. We know they lead to burnout. Instead, these are just guidelines that, when kept front of mind and followed most of the time, help teams maintain effective communication. A couple other examples of tactics teams can use to maintain connection is to hold intentional water cooler discussion time during work hours, and to actually establish core work hours, at least among team members that collaborate regularly. This is especially beneficial in a mobile testing team because of that collaboration I was talking about before. It's nice to work with coworkers who have access to different mobile devices, or to ask a question in real time to someone who knows a certain area of the app really well, or some history that you need to know to test your ticket or project optimally. So that's a lot of ways to stay connected. But the news lately is riddled with articles on video call fatigue and burnout. And the New York Times even wrote one called "Why Zoom is Terrible" that stated that video calls resembled in-person meetings about as much as packaged blueberry muffins resembled the homemade ones. And here we're talking about the packaged ones that don't even have blueberries in the ingredient list. I am a pretty big believer that no technology tool is objectively bad. It instead comes down to a balance of setting clear expectations and work options for the team to use, and just making that clear. But then also stepping back and being trusting and understanding when not every team member has the same work style, or when unexpected events come up, as has happened a lot this past year. Kids are out of school, home internet is not working some days. We've seen it all. And it turns out that team members feel a sense of belonging if there's an option to flex their work schedules, or if taking PTO is celebrated instead of considered a hardship. And especially in the current climate, these things really make a difference. But they can only exist on a team if there's trust between teammates and management that each person is doing their best. So it can be challenging to strike this balance between expectations for availability and trust and understanding, especially on a busy team of testers. So one way to make it easier is to increase transparency and knowledge transfer across the group. And while this info might have been shared almost effortlessly in an office, it cannot be taken for granted at home and requires that intentionality I keep coming back to like a broken record. So you might have a team meeting once a week where you review the in-flight projects and who has planned PTO, but there are lots of options here. You can publicize it in Slack or a shared calendar. Think about what success means for your team, and then make that clear so that everyone is set up to be successful. So to sum up, make remote mobile test team expectations clear, concise, and easy to remember. but also remember that teammates might be experiencing burnout or other challenges and need your understanding if they need to bend the rules. And lastly, provide clear avenues for teammates to ask questions and normalize engaging when someone asks for help. The knowledge sharing that results does the whole team good. All right, moving on. I see I'm crunched for time, so I'm going to go quick. For the last takeaway, I want to dive into a trend that is possibly the most interesting to gain popularity this year. And we've already heard it mentioned in at least a couple talks, I think, but it's pulling testing to the left. And I had to include a Beyonce slide here. It's just couldn't resist. It's pretty undisputed these days that waiting until the end to test a project is problematic, whether it's a major QA push at the end of waterfall development or an, in theory, more manageable job at the end of an agile sprint. Testing helps determine the stability and shippability of the product, and leaving that as a big question mark until the end is a pretty substantial risk that can lead to dilemmas such as choosing between breaking customer commits and pushing the release date or potentially shipping a product with known defects. So pulling testing left asks, what if we didn't do it that way and instead started considering quality with initial product ideation and required positive assurance of quality from the testers as one of the last gates before shipment? What if we could catch and remedy issues at the requirement stage before time was sunk into coding things a certain way? And speaking of code, what if the code was written with testing in mind and automation and unit tests were developed at the same time as the code itself? So perhaps the most comprehensive description of pulling testing left is building a culture of quality in which testers are present throughout the development process, from those early stage design meetings to foresee challenges and sticking points, all the way through to carefully considering the plan for rolling out the feature to customers to ensure the user experience is good. And additionally, everyone involved in the project, whether developer, project manager, or obviously tester, is keeping quality and testability front of mind. So kind of that we're all testers concept that Eric touched upon in his keynote earlier today. So there are 5 main methods to pull testing left that have emerged that seem to have the largest impact on quality across the board. And we'll go through these pretty quick. Consider quality during requirements gathering, test-driven development and early automation, test sooner and more, early customer and stakeholder feedback, and definition of done. So gathering requirements kicks off the start of a project. So it's pretty hard to think about testing sooner than that. But I'm just going to touch on why I think this is great in the mobile situation. So if you're a mobile tester like me and you're in one of these requirements meetings, there are a couple of ways that you might benefit the meeting. First, I always have a ton of mobile devices on my desk and also a local environment set up with a simulator and emulator. So when questions come up about current behavior, I can be the first one to raise my hand and say, hey, I'm already trying it. This is how it works. And then also the tester has probably a pretty good historical understanding of testing scope, and depending on what's being talked about in terms of scope of the project, the tester might be able to raise their hand and say, hey, I have concerns. The last time we touched that piece of code, we had to test all of this other stuff and ran into some brittleness. Is there another way we could do it? Here's an idea. So things like that. So I'm going to move on. Test-driven automation is so popular in the industry these days that it's almost considered synonymous with pulling testing left. But I'd like to highlight that it's a subset of the ways to do it. And basically, test-driven development means that the developer starts a project by writing a test that, of course, fails because there's no code yet. And then they write the code such that the test passes. So they're thinking about the boundary conditions and potential defect minefields even before they code out the feature. And this creates a product with fewer issues waiting to be found right before the ship date, and means that tests, these are usually unit tests, are complete at the same time the project is code complete. So 2 big hurdles cleared at once. And it's worth noting that often a tester helps review these tests and may take over running the resulting tests to some degree after the fact. But of course, unit tests are not enough, especially in mobile development where functional UI tests are incredibly important given the range of devices and OS versions out there. So to minimize the manual testing burden, as many of these checks as possible should be automated. And it turns out that if you have a flexible automation framework, these automation tasks can start as soon as the project requirements are in place. And also those automating the mobile changes can consider what permutations of automation runs are called for. For example, will the mobile code ship before API support is ready? That means we need to run mobile against old API and new API, things like that. So testing early, I just want to highlight one thing here, which is the cost of a defect. And I want to call out that it's not static. It changes depending on where the team is at in that development process. So if a defect crops up the day before shipment, that's going to be an expensive fix. And it doesn't just affect you and the developer, it affects customers, stakeholders, customer support. You don't want that bug. But if you find and fix a defect really early, it's quite cheap to fix. It involves a few people and it might even eliminate other similar issues at the same time, which then leaves you more time to test other parts of the feature later on. And then lastly, how can teams enable early testing? Cutting and deploying mobile app versions can be expensive. So consider testing early locally, maybe using a simulator or emulator. And then later, when you need to test things on a physical device, like maybe how does video calling affect battery life? Wait on that a bit and wait until you have builds. All right. So early customer and stakeholder feedback. I just want to say something really quick about this because I see my time is ticking. It's great to have a demo region or even a beta version of your app that customers and salespeople can play with. And that will usually be a shinier, newer version of the product than is being used primarily out there in the real world. But the key here is that you need to have a clear line of communication and good error monitoring so that the defects get noticed and fixed. And so testers can improve test strategy by understanding those real customer use cases. So only useful if you can get that feedback loop going. And lastly, testers should have a say in what done means for a project, ideally being one of those last official OKs before shipment. And this means that done isn't the same as code complete. Done usually happens after that because there's going to be a little bit of bug finding and fixing after that code complete happens. And then there's also typically a release sequencing discussion that can happen here because of that API. There are other parts of your app and platform that might have to ship at the same time. So to wrap up, a great way to regain some efficiency in a remote world is to consider ways to pull testing left in your respective teams. There's a lot more to it than test-driven development. In reality, it's a mix of things you take initiative for yourself, such as test planning as soon as some requirements are there, and things to work on with your team, such as enabling customer support and other stakeholders to get their hands on early mobile beta versions. So as we approach the end of our time together, I just want to recap quickly by sharing the main takeaways again. So first, for successful mobile testing in remote or hybrid work environments, you need the right technology for the problem you're trying to solve. Secondly, it's important to intentionally craft functional team dynamics when not working in the office with your team. Consider ways to build connection, but balance that with respect for individual needs and boundaries. And lastly, pull quality to the left to create a development process in which mobile testers are involved every step of the way and are able to help ensure quality is built into the fabric of the product. I hope that these points help each of you to optimize your testing of mobile apps on your respective teams at your respective companies for the remainder of the pandemic and beyond. Please feel free to contact me now or at any time in the future with questions or comments. And I'm just going to throw out a shameless plug to please tune into my panel on the state of QA if you're free tomorrow. It will be an open discussion with a couple of the other conference speakers, Irina Saprin and Dirk-Jan de Groot, as well as QA consultant Kartik Iyer and test team manager Val Lord. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for taking the time to attend my session today.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I didn't even have to give you a 5-minute warning. So we do have a couple minutes yet.
Oh, good. I was worried. I saw my timer counting up and was like, oh no, talk faster.
No, you're good. But we did have a couple questions in the chat, so Excellent. I'll read them to you if that's all right. Joe asked, documentation collaboration. You stated using folders for teams and projects. What about business users working on their own level of testing on your app? Can you talk more about how your documentation is organized now and if it's working well?
Definitely. So our document organization is really tailored to our team structure. And our team structure is maybe a bit unique. Our development team is broken into pods of people, and each of those pods serves a customer persona or kind of like a use case of our product, basically. And so there might be a team that serves EMTs, for example. And so then our documentation is organized into folders for each of those pods. And then within those pod folders, there's folders for each project. And those are transparent. The hope is that someone from another team, the product owner or customer support, could go in there pretty easily, find their way around, say, oh, I have a question from an EMS customer about this upcoming project, and they could follow the structure and get to where they needed to go, and then have the permissions to actually view everything out there. Honestly, we're still working out the kinks, but that's kind of the goal and the direction we're going. But I think the key maybe there is to think about your team structure and organize that way. Like what works for us might not work for other companies or teams at all.
Okay, thank you. Chris also had the question, what percentage of your testing can be done on emulators and what percentage need physical devices? He says, it seems like it would be tough to share and test physical devices when the testers aren't all sitting in the same office.
Yes, this is so true. So you'll laugh at us. We were a little bit ahead of the curve, maybe because I went remote before the pandemic hit, and my manager thought about it a little bit and was like, oh, we need each team member to have a representative number of devices. So I have 2 Androids and 2 iOSs across a few OS versions, but that didn't save us. There was one time in the last year or so where I actually needed to snail mail a device to a coworker I was in Idaho at the time and had to mail it to Montana. And it took a while because mail takes longer these days. So that was a bummer. I feel like our reliance on physical devices is maybe more necessary because of what we're testing. A lot of our app functionality has to do with alerting, and emulators and simulators just aren't great at that. It's hard to kind of set up a team of fake medical workers and work through a scenario and verify that each device is receiving the right sound at the right time and it's audible. And we've just found that we need to test as close to how the customer is as we can. So we test a lot of UI stuff on simulators and emulators, and I do a lot of early testing that I can do that way. But when the rubber meets the road and we're really digging into testing a feature, we're relying a lot more on physical devices at that point in time.